October 14, 1943, 13:32 hours. 27,000 feet above the German border. The world outside the plexiglass waistgun window is a masterpiece of hostile beauty, a brilliant sapphire blue sky so thin and pure it feels like the edge of space. Below, a soft, unbroken sea of white clouds hides the earth. For Staff Sergeant Frank Pitlack of the 306th Bomb Group, gripping the frozen steel of his .50 caliber Browning M2, this serene vista is a lie. It is the calm surface of a shark-infested ocean. His oxygen mask feels tight. The recycled rubber tastes a constant reminder of how alien this environment is. Every breath is a conscious effort, a cold fog blooming and vanishing with each exhalation. The low, gut-deep thrum of the four Wright R1820 Cyclone engines of his B-17G, the We the People, is the only music in this sky. It's a sound of life, of power, of a promise to get home, a promise that feels increasingly fragile. Frank shifts his gaze from the clouds to the reassuring sight of their escort. Dozens of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, stout and powerful, weaving a protective blanket around the bomber formation. They are the little friends, the guardians against the wolves. But Frank, like every other man in the 291 bombers of the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions, knows the clock is ticking. He checks his wristwatch, the condensation on its face freezing into tiny crystals. They've just crossed the border near Aachen. The little friends are low on fuel. Then he sees it. A slight, almost imperceptible change in the formation to his left. The lead P-47 pilot waggles his wings, a final silent goodbye. One by one, then in pairs, the Thunderbolts peel away, their silver fuselages banking steeply, tracing graceful arcs back towards England. Back towards safety, a knot of ice forms in Frank's stomach. The sky, once reassuringly crowded, suddenly feels vast and empty. The bomber stream presses on alone. 291 flying fortresses carrying over 10,000 men, now naked in enemy territory. The intercom crackles, the pilot's voice tight and strained. "Okay, boys, escort's gone. Keep your eyes peeled. Target is Schweinfurt. Schweinfurt." The name is a curse whispered in every briefing room, the heart of Nazi Germany's ball-bearing production. A target so vital the Luftwaffe would throw everything they had at them to protect it. They'd tried once before in August, and it had been a bloodbath. Now they were going back, without escort. Deep in his sprawling headquarters at Hall, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring knew this moment was coming. His radar stations had been tracking the formation for hours. He knew the range of the American fighters down to the last gallon of fuel. He had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever fly over the Reich. Now, watching them penetrate his airspace, he wasn't worried. He was confident. His pilots, his Jagdflieger, were waiting. The Americans, he believed, were arrogant fools, sending their boys to the slaughter in unescorted daylight raids. He was about to prove it. The sky would burn. For Göring and his Luftwaffe, this was not a battle. It was a harvest. To understand the carnage of October 1943, one must first understand the doctrine that sent men like Frank Pitlack into the heart of the Reich. It was born from a theory, a powerful and seductive idea that held sway over Allied air commanders, strategic daylight precision bombing. The concept, championed by the U.S. Army Air Force's USAAF, was audacious. It argued that wars could be won not by grinding infantry battles, but by crippling an enemy's industrial heart. Destroy their factories, their oil refineries, their transportation hubs, and their ability to wage war would simply wither and die. The instrument for this theory was the B-17 Flying Fortress. Its very name was a piece of propaganda, a promise of invincibility, and on paper, it was a formidable weapon system. Bristling with up to 13 .50 caliber machine guns, it was designed to defend itself. The theory dictated that by flying in tight, overlapping formations known as combat boxes, the bombers could create a zone of interlocking fire, a self-defending hedgehog of machine guns that no enemy fighter could penetrate. Each box containing 18 to 21 bombers could theoretically bring hundreds of heavy machine guns to bear on any attacker. Multiply that by an entire combat wing, and the sheer volume of defensive fire was meant to be overwhelming. The target for this aerial armada was the German war machine, a complex web of industry meticulously mapped by Allied intelligence. The combined bomber offensive, a joint Anglo-American strategy, assigned the USAAF the task of striking these targets by day, while the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command struck by night. The Americans believed their Norden bomb sight allowed for surgical precision that was only possible in daylight, hitting specific factories while minimizing civilian casualties. But there was a fatal flaw in this grand equation. a variable that planners had dangerously underestimated: the German Luftwaffe. The defenders were not a disorganized militia. They were a battle-hardened, technologically advanced air force fighting for their homeland. Their primary weapons were two of the finest piston-engine fighters of the war. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, or Gustav, was a nimble, high-altitude interceptor, a thoroughbred that had dominated the skies since 1937. It was fast, climbed like a rocket, and its nose-mounted cannon could shred a bomber's wing spar. Its partner in crime was the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a radial engine beast nicknamed the Verge, or Butcher Bird. The FW-190 was a bruiser, heavily armed with up to 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, exceptionally fast at low and medium altitudes, and incredibly durable. It was arguably the best all-around fighter in the world in 1943. The German pilots, the Jagdflieger, had systematically dissected the American combat box. They knew its weaknesses. They developed brutal and effective tactics. They learned that a frontal head-on attack was the most devastating. The closing speed of over 500 miles per hour gave the B-17's gunners mere seconds to react, and a burst of 20mm cannon fire into the cockpit could kill the pilots instantly, sending a 10-man crew and a 60,000-pound aircraft spiraling to its doom. For this, they used the Bf-109s. For attacks from the rear, where the 50 calibers were densest, they deployed twin-engine Zerstörer or destroyers, like the Bf-110. These larger aircraft were platforms for heavy armament, including massive 21cm air-to-air rockets, which could be fired into the bomber boxes from outside the effective range of the machine guns. Designed not to hit a single plane, but to break up the entire defensive formation. Once a bomber was damaged and forced out of the box, it was a lone sheep, set upon by the wolves, the waiting FW-190s, who would pounce and tear it apart. This lethal German response created the central crisis for the 8th Air Force, the escort problem. The American fighters based in England, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, were excellent aircraft. The P-47 was a monster, incredibly tough and heavily armed with 8 50 caliber guns. The P-38 was a fast, high-climbing twin-engine fighter, but both suffered from a critical limitation: range. They were thirsty for fuel. They could escort the bombers over the Channel, over the Low Countries, and perhaps just inside the German border. But for targets deep within the Reich, Berlin, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, they simply could not make the round trip. A map in the 8th Air Force headquarters told the story with a series of concentric circles extending from England. The circles were the combat radii of their fighters. Beyond them lay a vast, unprotected corridor of death where the bombers had to fly alone. This was Göring's killing ground, and Schweinfurt lay deep within it. For the air crews of the mighty 8th, life was a strange paradox of comfort and terror. They lived on well-appointed bases in the English countryside, with warm beds, hot meals, and dances on the weekend. They were the elite, the flyboys. But this veneer of normalcy masked a brutal statistical reality. An 8th Air Force bomber crewman in 1943 had a lower chance of surviving his 25-mission tour of duty than a Marine fighting in the Pacific. The mission began long before dawn, with a jarring wake-up call from a clerk, a quick breakfast of powdered eggs, then the briefing. The room would fill with the smoke of 100 cigarettes as the young men, most barely out of their teens, shuffled in, wearing their thick, fleece-lined flight jackets. The tension was palpable. Then the curtain over the large wall map would be pulled back, revealing a long red string stretching from England, across the Channel, deep into the black heart of Germany. A collective groan would ripple through the room if the string went deep. Schweinfurt, Berlin, Oschersleben. The names of places they'd never heard of a year ago were now potential epitaphs. The process of preparing for flight was a ritual against the fear, strapping on layers of clothing against the unimaginable cold of high altitude, where temperatures could plummet to 50 or 60 degrees below zero. Checking and rechecking the oxygen systems, the guns, the ammunition feeds. Each man was a specialist: pilot and co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. 10 men, their lives intertwined, their survival dependent on each other's skill and courage. As the B-17 lumbered into the air, the fear would subside, replaced by the intense focus of the task at hand. The assembly of the massive formations was a feat in itself, a ballet of hundreds of heavy aircraft joining up into their combat boxes, a process that could take over an hour. During this time, they were still in the relative safety of English airspace. The crews would test-fire their guns, short bursts of orange tracers stitching the sky. Then came the moment of truth, reaching the enemy coast. The flak, German anti-aircraft fire, would begin. Puffs of black smoke would blossom around the formation, each one a potential harbinger of death. The aircraft would be rocked by the concussions, the sound of shrapnel peppering the aluminum skin like hail on a tin roof. This was the first test of nerve, but the real terror began when the escorts left. For a ball turret gunner, suspended in a cramped plexiglass bubble beneath the aircraft, the world became a 360-degree panorama of vulnerability. For a waist gunner, the open window was a portal to a freezing, windswept hell. Their job was simple and horrifying. Scan the endless blue for the tiny black specks that would resolve in seconds into enemy fighters. The call over the intercom, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," was an injection of pure adrenaline. The dance would begin, fighters swarming like angry hornets, the deafening roar of your own .50 calibers firing just inches from your head, the smell of cordite filling the fuselage, the sight of another B-17 in your formation, a plane full of men you had breakfast with, suddenly blossoming into a bright orange fireball, the slow, agonizing pirouette of a crippled bomber falling out of formation, trailing smoke, the surreal horror of seeing parachutes, sometimes 5, sometimes only 1, sometimes none at all. Every minute was an eternity. Every mission shaved a piece off a man's soul. They flew through fear, exhaustion, and frostbite. They returned to bases where crews they knew were simply gone, their bunks empty, their belongings quietly packed away by morning. The 25-mission tour was a lottery, and in the autumn of 1943, the house was winning. The 8th Air Force was being bled white, and the men knew it. They prayed for clouds to scrub the mission. They prayed for engine trouble, and most of all, they prayed for fighter escort that could go all the way. On the other side of the English Channel, the perspective was entirely different. For a German Jagdflieger like Major Egon Meyer, Gruppenkommandeur of Jagdgeschwader 2, the approaching American bomber streams were not a source of terror, but of opportunity. They were predictable, slow-moving targets, a challenge to his skill and a chance to defend his homeland. The mood in the German fighter-ready rooms was not one of fear, but of grim professional confidence. The German command structure, under the umbrella of the Reichsluftverteidigung, Reich Air Defense, was a highly sophisticated and integrated system. A chain of Freya and Würzburg radar stations stretched across the occupied territories in Germany, providing early warning of incoming raids. This information was fed to central command posts, where experienced controllers plotted the altitude, speed, and heading of the bomber formations. They could see the entire battle unfolding on their plotting tables. They knew with near certainty where the American fighter escorts would have to turn back. This was the trigger point. As the P-47s and P-38s departed, the German controllers would begin to vector their fighter wings to intercept points along the bomber's path. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Different Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings, would be assigned specific roles in timed attacks. One wing might engage the bombers over Belgium, another would wait to hit them deeper in Germany, and a third would be held in reserve to attack the crippled formations as they limped for home. The pilots themselves were a formidable force. Many were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, the Battle of Britain, and the brutal Eastern Front. They were masters of their aircraft and of aerial combat tactics. An expert or ace was not an anomaly. Entire squadrons were led by men with dozens, sometimes over 100 aerial victories. They held the American crews in a kind of professional contempt. They saw the daylight bombing strategy as a reckless waste of life, a blunt instrument that betrayed a fundamental misunderstanding of air warfare. Their confidence was rooted in results. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943 had cost the Americans 60 heavy bombers, 600 men, and millions of dollars of equipment destroyed or captured in a single day. From the German perspective, this was an unsustainable loss rate for the Allies. Hermann Göring, whose prestige had suffered after the Battle of Britain, saw this as his redemption. He believed his Luftwaffe was winning a decisive battle of attrition. He encouraged his pilots with promises of medals and accolades. He assured Hitler that the American bomber threat would be broken. The German pilots knew their mission was perilous. Flying into the massed fire of a combat box was incredibly dangerous, but they had faith in their tactics. The head-on pass, championed by aces like Mayer, was their trump card. They would form up in a line abreast, sometimes an entire staffel of 12 fighters, and fly directly through the front of the bomber formation. It was a high-stakes game of chicken at a closing speed of over 800 feet per second, but it was lethally effective. So as the teletypes clattered in the operations rooms of German airfields on the morning of October 14, 1943, there was a sense of anticipation. The Americans were coming back to Schweinfurt. They were coming back deep, and they were coming in force. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, climbing into the cockpits of their Bf-109s and FW-190s, the sky was their arena. The enemy was coming to them, just as they expected. Today, they would teach the USAAF another bloody lesson. At 13:33 hours, 1 minute after the last P-47 turned for home, the German controllers began their work. Across western Germany, airfield horns blared. Ground crews scrambled, pulling chocks and starting engines. From bases at Rheine, Münster, and Dortmund, the fighters of Jagdgeschwader 1 and 26 clawed for altitude, their propellers chewing at the thin, cold air. They were the first wave. Inside the bomber stream, the disquieting peace was shattered. The intercom and Frank Pitlack's B-17 crackled to life. Bandits 2 o'clock high coming in. Pitlack swiveled his .50 caliber, his eyes straining against the glare. He saw them, not specks but a swarm. Dozens of FW-190s, glinting in the sun, positioning themselves for the attack. They weren't coming in piecemeal. They were organized, disciplined, and they were coming with a purpose. The attack began not with fighters but with rockets. A formation of twin-engine Bf-110 Zerstörer appeared, staying just outside of effective machine gun range. They ripple-fired their 21 cm Werfer granite rockets. The projectiles, trailing thick plumes of white smoke, corkscrewed lazily toward the formation. They weren't aimed at individual planes. They were aimed at the box. An explosion of black and orange rocked the sky just ahead of Pitlack's group. A B-17 from the lead squadron shuddered violently as its wing was torn open by the blast. It faltered, its engines sputtering, and began to fall away from the protective embrace of the formation. Instantly, like sharks sensing blood, 2 FW-190s detached from the main group and dove on the cripple. Tracers from the dying bomber's guns reached out in desperation, but it was no use. A sustained burst of 20mm cannon fire tore the B-17's tail section clean off. It tumbled out of the sky end over end. No parachutes. Then came the head-on pass. A wave of Bf-109s appeared dead ahead, flying in perfect formation, seeming to hang motionless in the sky as the bombers flew towards them. The closing speed was terrifying. The nose gunners in the lead bombers opened up, their tracers reaching out into the void. In the final seconds, the German fighters opened fire. A torrent of cannon shells and machine gun bullets ripped through the front of the combat box. Plexiglass shattered. Cockpits disintegrated. The B-17 flying off Pitlack's left wing, the Patches, took a direct hit. Its nose section simply vanished in a flash of fire and debris. The plane pitched up violently, stalled, and then began its final fatal spin. The sky became a maelstrom of chaos. A three-dimensional knife fight played out over dozens of square miles. German fighters attacked with relentless ferocity, pressing their attacks to point-blank range. They came from every direction, high, low, from the front, and the deadly 6 o'clock position at the rear. The American gunners, fighting hypoxia and frostbite, threw up a wall of lead. The air was thick with smoke, tracers and spent shell casings ejecting from the waist guns and clattering on the fuselage floor. The carefully maintained combat boxes began to fray. A damaged bomber, struggling to keep up, created a gap. The German pilots, masters of their craft, exploited every opening. They swarmed any plane that showed a sign of weakness. A smoking engine, a sluggish response. For the crews inside, it was a private hell. The flight engineer of the We the People screamed over the intercom that engine number 3 was on fire. The pilot feathered the prop, but the bomber began to lose speed and altitude, falling behind the rest of its squadron. They were now a straggler. Alone. Pitlack saw 2 FW-190s peel off and line up on their tail. This was it. The top turret and tail gunner opened fire, their tracers converging on the lead attacker. For a moment it seemed to work. The FW-190 pilot, seeing the concentrated fire, broke off his attack. But his wingman was undeterred. He pressed on, his cannons winking. A series of sledgehammer blows struck the B-17's fuselage. Pitlack felt a searing pain in his leg as shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin. The radio operator, just a few feet away, slumped over his set, motionless. The raid pressed on toward the target, a river of bombers flowing through a gauntlet of fighters. They dropped their bombs on the smoking ruins of the Schweinfurt factories, then turned for the long, agonizing flight home. But the attacks did not stop. Fresh German fighter wings, refueled and rearmed, rose to meet them on the return leg. The running battle continued all the way back to the border. By the time the shattered remnants of the force reached the safety of the English coast, the sky was growing dark. The final tally was horrifying. 60 B-17s shot down. Another 17 damaged so badly they would never fly again. 138 more suffered battle damage. Over 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. It was the single greatest defeat the USAAF had suffered to that point in the war. Black Thursday, as it would be known, had proven Hermann Göring right. The American strategy of unescorted daylight bombing had failed, shattered against the iron wall of the Luftwaffe. The aftermath of Black Thursday sent a shockwave through the high command of the 8th Air Force. The loss rates were unsustainable. The daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th, was forced to suspend all deep penetration raids into Germany. It seemed Göring had won. The strategy of attrition had worked. The skies over the Reich belonged to the Luftwaffe. But even as the grim reports from Schweinfurt were being compiled, a solution was emerging, not from a committee of strategists, but from the workshops of engineers and the daring of test pilots. The solution had a name: the North American Aviation P51 Mustang. The P51's origin story was itself an unexpected twist. It wasn't designed for the USAF. It was built at the request of the British in 1940, who needed more fighters, fast. The initial design, powered by an American Allison V1710 engine, was a good low to medium altitude fighter, but its performance dropped off dramatically at the high altitudes where heavy bombers operated. It was good, but not a game changer. The magic ingredient came from Britain. In a stroke of genius, engineers at Rolls-Royce decided to experimentally fit a P51 airframe with their legendary Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant used in the Spitfire. The Merlin was equipped with a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger, allowing it to maintain its horsepower at extreme altitudes. The result was astonishing. The marriage of the advanced American aerodynamic airframe, with its groundbreaking laminar flow wing design, and the high-performance British engine, created a thoroughbred. The new aircraft, designated the P51B, was faster than a Spitfire, more maneuverable than an FW190 at high altitude, and crucially, had an enormous internal fuel capacity. When fitted with external drop tanks, first 75-gallon tanks, then later massive 108-gallon tanks, the P51 Mustang had an unprecedented combat radius of over 850 miles. It could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes over the target, and fly back with fuel to spare. The fighter gap on the strategy maps, that corridor of death over Germany, had been erased. The arrival of the P51 in England in late 1943 coincided with a seismic shift in command. General Eaker was transferred, and his place was taken by a hard-charging, aggressive commander, General James Jimmy Doolittle, famous for his 1942 raid on Tokyo. Doolittle looked at the existing fighter escort doctrine, which mandated that fighters stick close to the bombers at all times, and saw it as fundamentally defensive and wasteful. He issued a new, revolutionary directive in early 1944. His order to his fighter pilots was simple and electrifying. Your primary mission is to destroy German fighters. He was unleashing his hunters. Escorts were no longer to be passive bodyguards. Once they reached enemy territory, they were free to roam ahead of the bomber stream, to sweep the skies, to seek out the Luftwaffe and destroy it wherever it could be found, in the air, on its airfields during takeoff and landing, anywhere. The American strategy shifted from protecting the bombers to annihilating the enemy's air force. The bombers became the bait, and the P51 Mustang was the hook. This combination, a superior long-range fighter and an aggressive new tactic, was about to be unleashed on an unsuspecting Luftwaffe. The stage was set for the largest air battle of the war, a campaign that would become known as Big Week. In February 1944, the storm broke. Big Week, or Operation Argument, was a massive coordinated assault by the USAF and the RAF against the German aircraft industry. Over 1,000 heavy bombers at a time, escorted by nearly as many fighters, struck deep into the heart of the Reich, and this time, things were different. For the German Jagdflieger, the first encounters with the new reality were a profound shock. A Luftwaffe pilot, climbing to intercept what he believed would be a vulnerable bomber stream near Leipzig or Brunswick, suddenly found his own airspace swarming with enemy fighters. These were not the familiar short-legged P-47s. These were sleek, silver P-51s, And they weren't waiting by the bombers. They were high above, prowling with the sun at their backs, waiting to pounce. The psychological impact on the German pilots cannot be overstated. Their home sky, their sanctuary, was no longer safe. The predictability of the American raids was gone. P-51s would appear seemingly out of nowhere, diving on German formations as they assembled to attack the bombers. The hunter had become the hunted. German pilots were now being shot down over their own airfields, their parachutes landing in fields they had known since childhood. The experience of a young German pilot was transformed from one of confident aggression to a desperate struggle for survival. The veterans, the aces who had racked up enormous scores against the Russians and the unescorted B-17s, were now locked in a deadly battle of equals, or worse. The P-51 could outturn the Bf-109 at high speed and outrun the FW-190 at high altitude. The American pilots, many of them young and inexperienced just months before, were now gaining combat experience rapidly. They were flying a superior aircraft and using aggressive tactics that put the Germans constantly on the defensive. The attrition rate for the Luftwaffe's fighter arms skyrocketed. Worse than the loss of aircraft was the loss of irreplaceable pilots. The grueling training program for a Luftwaffe pilot took nearly 2 years. As experienced expert 10 were shot down and killed, they were replaced by hastily trained teenagers with only a fraction of the flight hours. These new pilots were no match for the combat-hardened Americans in their Mustangs. The quality of the German fighter force began to plummet. Morale crumbled. Pilots who had once eagerly scrambled to meet the enemy now did so with a sense of dread. For the American bomber crews, the change was nothing short of a miracle. On the long, harrowing journey into Germany, they would look out their windows and see the comforting sight of P-51s weaving above and around them, their silver fuselages a symbol of protection. The relief and gratitude were immense. The chatter on the intercoms changed from panicked calls of "bandits" to jubilant shouts of "look at those Mustangs go." The P-51 pilots became heroes, knights of the air. Men like Don Blakesley, George Preddy, and Clarence "Bud" Anderson became legends, their squadrons racking up incredible scores against the beleaguered Luftwaffe. The 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys, shot down over 600 enemy aircraft in just over a year. The famed 332nd Fighter Group, the all-black Tuskegee Airmen, painted the tails of their Mustangs red and earned a reputation as some of the most skilled and determined bomber escorts in the 8th Air Force, never losing a single bomber under their direct protection. The balance of power in the sky had irrevocably shifted. Göring's laughter had fallen silent, replaced by the angry, desperate reports from his field commanders. His unstoppable air force was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, pilot by pilot. The psychological dominance he had enjoyed in the autumn of 1943 was shattered. The fear now lived on his side of the channel. The results of the P-51's introduction and Doolittle's strategy were swift and decisive. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was a shadow of its former self. During Big Week in February, the Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters and, more critically, 100 of its best pilots. The losses continued to mount in March and April. By May 1944, the month before the Normandy invasion, the Luftwaffe was a broken force. It could still put up a fight, but it could no longer seriously challenge Allied air supremacy over the continent. This victory in the skies was the essential prerequisite for the success of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. On that historic day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe flew barely 300. The German ground troops in Normandy were mercilessly pounded from the air by Allied fighter bombers, with virtually no protection from their own air force. The panzers could not move by day without being attacked. Supply lines were severed. The overwhelming air superiority, won in the skies over Germany months earlier by the P-51s, ensured that the beachhead could be established and reinforced. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, would later state that the P-51 Mustang was one of the most significant single weapons that contributed to the Allied victory. With the Luftwaffe effectively neutralized, the combined bomber offensive could proceed with devastating effect. The B-17s and B-24s, now with escort all the way to their targets and back, systematically pulverized Germany's synthetic oil production facilities, its transportation network, and its industrial cities. The German war machine was slowly and inexorably choked to death. The late introduction of German wonder weapons like the Me-262 jet fighter, while technologically superior to any Allied aircraft, was too little, too late. There were not enough of them, not enough fuel to fly them, and not enough experienced pilots left to make a strategic difference. P-51 pilots quickly developed tactics to counter the jets, primarily by attacking them during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. The story of the P-51 Mustang is a powerful lesson in how technological innovation, combined with a bold tactical shift, can completely alter the course of a war. It demonstrates that a weapon is only as good as the strategy that employs it. The B-17, conceived as a self-defending fortress, was vulnerable. The P-51, conceived as a medium-altitude fighter for the British, became the long-range key that unlocked the sky over Europe. Hermann Göring's boast, and his laughter in the autumn of 1943, had been based on a temporary and fragile advantage. He failed to anticipate the speed of Allied innovation and the sheer scale of American industrial might. His confident hunters, the aces of the Luftwaffe, were ultimately ground down and destroyed by an unforeseen weapon and a commander who was not afraid to change the rules of the game. The clear blue sky over Germany, once a killing ground for American airmen, became their domain, and in securing it they sealed the fate of the Third Reich.